natural resources plan updates. We'll be holding this hybrid public meeting, which enables remote electronic participation as legally authorized by the Code of Virginia for the Planning Commission's electronic meeting policy adopted July 7, 2022. We have planning commissioners who are here in person. Do we have anybody who is participating remotely, either online or by telephone? If so, raise your hand remotely or say something on the phone. Okay, good. Not hearing anybody. At this time, I'd like to orient everyone to our hybrid environment and cover a few specifics about how tonight's meeting will run. Members of the public may attend the meeting here in person or electronically by using the Microsoft Teams link provided on the LRPC web pages, on the county's events calendar, and the email notifications sent to the LRPC email subscribers. Additionally, there is a dial-in phone option for those who wish to use it. For our planning commissioners joining virtually, if anyone loses connectivity during today's meeting, please reconnect with us by phone. Please keep your phones and devices muted until you're called upon. Turn off sound to any other devices around you to minimize interference. And for our virtual attendees using Microsoft Teams, please turn off your video feed. I will address when it's appropriate to turn it on in a moment. The Microsoft Teams meeting chat is active for two purposes: for participants who need technical assistance and for other attendees to pose brief clarifying questions to the larger audience. While these will be monitored, they will not be formally acknowledged. The staff may address these comments as appropriate. Teams chat should not be used for discussion or for any inappropriate statements. Those who are planning to provide public comment will still need to do so at the end, as the chat will not serve that opportunity. There will be 2 periods of public comment for this meeting, which will follow after the LRPC discussion of each agenda item. All public comments must be shared verbally for the record during the assigned public testimony periods. I'd also like to remind everyone in the room, when you're here in the room, to speak up slowly and clearly, because we have microphones at the ceiling, and that's where your voice is being picked up. In addition, if you'd like to share your screen, please request permission from the LRPC chair prior to doing so. Let's see. We don't have anybody on video or on phone. For members of the public who would like to provide feedback and comment, unlike the Planning Commission's regular meetings, the LRPC agenda items are not public hearings. Therefore, public comment is at the LRPC chair's discretion after the committee discussion is concluded. I am exercising the discretion to have public comment at the end of each of these items. You will be called on at the end of the LRPC discussion to speak on tonight's agenda items. The speaking time allotted will depend on the number of speakers we have this evening, probably be 2 minutes per person. I will call the speakers after each agenda item, and I will ask staff to let me know if we have any virtual attendees who'd like to provide comment. Staff will acknowledge speakers on the Teams chat. Please indicate in the chat that you'd like to provide comment, and your name will be added to the list of speakers. Members of the public attending virtually will speak first during the public comment period, followed by the in-person attendees. And when virtual attendees are called upon to speak, you must unmute yourself by clicking on the microphone icon that's located on your meeting command bar. The moderator does not have the ability to unmute you, and you will be muted, though, when your time has concluded. As an alternative, public comment is available and may be provided on the public comment form posted on the LRPC webpage. And finally, this is a public forum. Tonight's meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the county's website. All the information associated with today's meeting, whether written or spoken, is subject to the Freedom of Information Act requirements. There. That all said, we can now move on to our first agenda item, which is the Historic and Cultural Resources Plan update. And we have a staff presentation first. Oh, actually, why don't we do that? Thanks, Nia, for reminding me. We'll introduce who. We'll go around the room and introduce who's here. So actually, why don't we start with
Cynthia? Mr. Chair. I'm Cynthia LaChase Torres, and I lead the county's historic preservation program. Glad to be back.
Thea Bagley, Planning Commission.
Peter Robertson, Planning Commission.
Karen Gavada, Planning Commission.
Ryan Delaney, Department of Parks and Recreation. Leo Sarli with the Planning Commission.
Anika Chaudhary, CPHD planning. And Rana Ghazale, CPHD.
Thank you. And do we have any staff on virtual?
Hi,
Jennifer?
yes, Jennifer Fioretti, Deputy Director, Department of Parks and Recreation. Glad to be here.
Great. Ms. Rhodes, you're on, I see.
Margaret Rhodes, planning, thank you.
Okay. Other commissions, Ms. Van Hine. So you representing commissioner, or are you going to be here for yourself? You're on mute.
Yeah, I know. Hi, I'm just here to watch, so I'm
Okay.
happy to watch. Thank you.
Okay. And Ryan Delaney, I see you're on also.
Oh, yeah, that was just.
That's your,
line, yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, two, got it.
Sorry.
And Kelly Brown,
She's not.
she's not okay. Jen, okay, fine. Then we can move on ahead. Your turn.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, everyone. As I said, I am Cynthia LaChase Torres, and I lead the county's historic preservation program. I see some familiar faces and some new faces. Back in May, we first presented our historic and cultural resources plan update to the LRPC. And since then, we've completed a really robust public engagement period and analyzed both the feedback we received internally and externally on that draft. We've made some revisions to the draft plan, and an updated version that we are calling the recommended draft was released in mid-August. So we are here this evening to provide a brief overview of our planning process, to highlight the main changes that we made to the draft plan. And just as a reminder, our original plan, known formerly as the Historic Preservation Master Plan, is an element of the county's comprehensive plan, and it was last approved by the county board in December of 2006. So this update that we are doing now is our first official update to that plan. So our planning process has been going on for quite some time, since the beginning of the pandemic in spring 2020, in fact. On the left of this slide, we've outlined some of the major milestones that we've completed over these past 4 years, including a range of our public engagement efforts. And we also spent a considerable amount of time last year addressing initial input from interdepartmental colleagues as well as county leadership. So we released an initial draft of our plan for public review and comment in mid-April of this year. We also held a work session with the Historical Affairs and Landmark Review Board, along with our consultant in April. And concurrently with that, we led a public engagement period to seek feedback on the plan. From April until June, we hosted a community open house, as well as a series of 15 pop-up events that were held countywide, and also had an online feedback forum. We also did a social media campaign and developed a digital story map that highlighted the main goals proposed in the plan update. Hopefully this past spring, you also saw some of our yard signs that we had around the county promoting the plan, and perhaps you even caught one of our cultural heritage videos. We produced a new video about Moore's Barbershop, which is an African-American legacy business on Langston Boulevard. And we also re-released our 2021 video about Freddy's Beach Bar, which is an LGBTQ and straight-friendly bar in Crystal City. So as you can see on the right column, we're nearing the finish line after all these years. Later this month, on September 20th, we are presenting this recommended draft to the HLRB for their review and recommendations. And after that, we do remain on track to bring the request to advertise forward to both the Planning Commission and the County Board in October, followed by consideration for adoption of the recommended draft in November. And a separate implementation framework is also in progress, and we are finalizing that now with county leadership, both leading up to and following our plan adoption. So this is our timeline at a glance. It's a little hard to see at this level, but basically we show the major milestones that we've been working on each year since spring of 2020. And the orange colored box that's at the far right indicates how far we've come and shows the upcoming public hearings really as our final point here in our planning process. So as a quick refresher, there are 5 focus areas, 5 main goals in the draft plan. These remain unchanged since the previous version that was released back in the spring. So in summary, the main goals and objectives that are featured in the plan center on these 5 things. Building an inclusive understanding and support for the history, people, and places through community engagement work. Encouraging financial and other benefits of preservation through incentives. Integrating historic preservation with other county policies and priorities, as well as addressing the importance of cultural landscapes through expanding our partnerships. Improving regulation processes, creating new tools, preserving new types of historic resources, and establishing an archaeology program. And then lastly, expanding and improving both the historic resources inventory, or the HRI, and other preservation-based technology and information systems that we use. The forward-thinking goals and action items that are presented in the draft plan will allow our program to advocate for more meaningful preservation through increasing our partnerships and offering more flexibility and incentives into our standard preservation tools. We are proud that the updated plan also provides recommendations to preserve and interpret an inclusive collection of histories and resources for future generations. We also developed equity aspirations for each goal in the plan to describe how our achievements could advance inclusion, diversity, equity, and/or accessibility. So that brings us to, well, what's different between this draft and the one that you saw earlier in the spring. So as I mentioned before, between April and June of this year, we requested community input on the initial draft of the plan, and we spent the spring and summer analyzing that feedback and making minor revisions to the draft accordingly. And just so you know, for the online feedback form that we had in the spring, we had 163 responses, which is the highest level of responses we've gotten as part of our engagement to date. And participants who answered this question, we were able to determine that more than 36 different Arlington neighborhoods were represented from that feedback. So the changes that are reflected in the recommended draft that were released in mid-August are summarized here. So we added locations of historic resources and neighborhood reference points throughout the plan. This was actually a suggestion that LRPC gave to us back in the spring, and we really did agree that this additional information provided more educational opportunities for readers to help to teach them about historic places countywide. We also strengthened the connection between the historic built environment and the natural environment by adding more references to the county's biophilic initiatives. We likewise made several clarifications throughout the plan. These included providing additional context to certain sections of our statement of historical and cultural significance. We recognize county transportation projects as a potential partnership opportunity for us. We explained the size of proposed neighborhood heritage districts in our regulation goal, and we updated select section titles within the plan so they could be more specific. And the LRPC gave us quite a few suggestions back in the spring, and I wanted to address a few of those. We clarified the use of the term character, and that was a term that we used all throughout the plan. And we defined it better by associating it more with a preservation lens. So qualifying it with historic character, architectural character, or character defining features. There was a comment that LRPC gave us about updating the addresses towards the back of the plan in our HRI table. We ended up adding a disclaimer statement in that section stating that the table contains the raw current data that was originally approved by the county board in 2011. We do not change any of the street names nor indicate which buildings have since been preserved or demolished, so as to help reinforce the need for why an HRI update is so crucial. And so we wanted to keep the data as is to help illustrate that. The LRPC also hoped to see more maps and historic content in our draft, but we felt this could have resulted in too much detailed information in a document that was intended to be visionary and aspirational for us. But we do recognize the importance of having more maps and historic content available for the public. And so we explained some of these efforts in our goals for both community engagement and our technology and tools chapters. And as we mentioned earlier, we added more references to the locations of historic places so readers could learn about where to find some of the buildings and places featured in the plan. And lastly, and something that we're very excited about, we updated the icon that is used in our historic preservation wedge of the county's comprehensive plan color wheel. Previously, it had been a tablet icon that resembled either a historic marker or a gravestone, depending on your on your perspective. We thought that was a little confusing. So we decided to change it to something different that better reflected the broader breadth of what we do as a program. So it's a little hard to see in this image here, but there's 3 little icons that are within the circle there, and they reference architecture, historic interpretation, there's a historic marker there, as well as archaeology. So in conclusion, here are a few reminders and next steps. So please read the recommended draft if you haven't done so already, and consider filling out the online comment form that we have available so you can give feedback to the county board. And please consider sharing the plan with your colleagues, your neighbors, and others who might be interested in both history and preservation. And the online form will close on October 1st, just as a heads up. And then, of course, LRPC members will have additional opportunities to stay involved with our upcoming public hearings of the HLRB, as well as the full planning commission and the county board. So this concludes the staff presentation, and I'm happy to address any questions or comments that members might have.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
It's open to the table now, so Commissioner Bagley.
So I'm a big proponent of vision and your mission. I live in historic mineral courts. So do you believe that, this is a twofold question. One, do you believe that this new plan, if adopted, would provide more resources so that we could have saved something like, I think, the Logan House? Or do you believe that this is closer? Do you think there's anything that we could have, by going through that painful process, would this help?
That's a great question. And I think the short answer to that is yes. It's a very visionary plan. And I think as unfortunate as it was to have lost some very recognizable historic resources, the fact that that happened during this planning process, I think was very beneficial because it allowed us to assess the process that we have and ways that we can improve it. And so I think particularly in the regulation chapter, we start to address that a little bit, Commissioner Bagley, where we're talking about ways that we can improve how we do the level designation process here. And that's a crucial first step. So this is not changing process through the plan as it is now. It's allowing us to explore ways that we can make that process better.
Because a follow-up on
Sure.
that before my second question would be, it occurs to me in just watching some of this that folks who own these properties may not have the same appreciation for history, or it conflicts with the monetary side of things. And that the process for them to even take advantage of historic preservation credits or something adds time to a process, which then impedes the money portion of it. So hopefully we've done something to, or can in the future do something to address that. So it seems a little faster for somebody who's looking at that, because scraping and doing is faster than thinking about this or what my credits might be or something like that.
Yeah, that's another excellent point. And I think the answer to that is really twofold. It's dealing with our partnerships and our education, working with owners, explaining tools that are available, explaining different types of processes and designation and benefits and things like that. So it's that education, working with property owners to help them understand and get excited. But on the other hand, it's also working to have more flexibility in preservation. We recently started a new historic preservation fund. That's something we've never had before. So that's providing county dollars to people doing physical capital projects, but also doing non-capital projects that have an education focus. So I think some of the new tools and things that we are proposing that we study and explore once the plan is adopted will allow that flexibility and allow owners to perhaps participate in preservation in ways that either they haven't yet or in new ways that don't exist now.
So that would be more teeth in it than perhaps.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Then my last question is, as we, in SPRC processes, when there is something historic, regardless of what the significance is, we struggle every time, and generally we lose out. Even the most eloquent speakers on behalf of history, as they're talking, can't get the ripple going enough to save things, or it's torn down, or there's some tiles from this particular place that are there, or it just comes down to like a little historic marker. So is there more guidance in this now for when we are in those situations? Because it's really tough for us. Many of us have a lot of sympathy for this, but, you know, we're against all this, you know, and then it's like, who just wants an historic marker if there's something significant
Yeah,
there?
it's sort of too late by the time it gets.
Yeah, it's way too late.
Yes,
It's way too late.
Yes. we're better than where we were in the early 2000s before we had the plan. I don't know if that offers any reassurance or not, but being able to, and the way we describe it in this plan draft is being able to formalize how preservation is brought into conversations. And so being sure that we are part of site plans that affect historic resources, major planning studies like Plan Langston Boulevard and others that impact historic resources, being part of that core staff team, being part of those conversations, not on an ad hoc basis, but all the time. I think that's going to help that a lot.
So you're in on the 401?
Yes. Yes.
So let me follow up on Commissioner Bagley here. When the Clarendon sector plan was done, were those TDRs part of the original Clarendon sector plan that were within the Clarendon area? Because they've been successfully used. We were talking about this before the meeting. There were a number of historic properties that are now locked in as preserved because that development rights were transferred to a large project on Washington Boulevard within Clarendon. So that was really a success story, and it shows we've done it here in the county. Was that originally part of the Clarendon sector plan when it was being created to help preserve those?
Yes. So you're making me really think back a long time.
Long
And I
time.
might have to defer to Ms. Rhodes to make sure I'm not speaking out of turn, but from what I recall, yes, that was part of the philosophy behind the Clarendon sector plan, to be able to have these incentives. If you want to use that as your redevelopment tool, there were certain things, certain buildings that had to be preserved in full, certain frontages that had to be preserved, certain facades. And so those are all outlined very clearly in that plan. And you're correct, Mr. Chair, that using that plan has resulted in many of our most well-known preservation wins, because we've been able to incorporate either full preservation or facade preservation.
So we could then, presumably with Plan Lancaster Boulevard, those tools would still be available for historic preservation along up and down the corridor.
As far as I know, yes,
Okay, great.
yes. And we want to be able to make sure that we have a seat at the table, but also know that the importance of being able to balance what our preservation needs with other county priorities and policies as well. So
Okay. And do you know going back to whether that proposal of CRs was cleared with those property owners back at that time?
that I do not know the answer to.
Because I don't either. And it's-
Maybe someone from planning can recall that. I don't remember.
Oh, great. Commissioner Garrett has now joined us.
And commissioners.
And Commissioner Steinberger, yeah, she said she was not able to make it physically here, but she's here. So great. We have two more commissioners here. If you have comments, again, please raise your hand. I'll try to make sure I look regularly up there. Yes, Commissioner Kamara.
Hey, just a quick question. And this may be out of scope, but I'm just curious, how does the county go about making the decision? So for example, for Plan Langston Boulevard, there's a particular envisioning that's happening perhaps for the Lee Center. And that was built in 1926. It was actually one of the first public schools ever created in Arlington. And so if the community is interested in preserving that and that history, how do they go about doing this? And how do you, like you said, weigh sort of, county goals versus some of the historic aspects?
No, that's a very good question. So as the chairman mentioned with the Clarendon sector plan, there are specific buildings that have been identified. A similar exercise we went through for the Plan Langston Boulevard initiative, where we worked with the historic preservation cultural resources consultant to do a lot of research on various sites all throughout the corridor. And we worked with planning and housing staff to develop different recommendations for preservation. So it's not identical to how it's done in the sector plan, but that provides some baseline guidance. So looking ahead for future planning. But to answer your question, if a property owner or others wanted to try to preserve places, that's all spelled out in the county zoning ordinance. It's section 11.3, if you're 0.4, I believe, if you want to study up on it, but it's all spelled out. And if it's, we've had a few contentious designations in recent years, and those primarily have been because the people requesting the designation were not the property owners. When we have property owners who are willing to preserve and want to be stewards of their property and they come to us to request, the process tends to go a little bit more smoothly because they understand what they're getting into and it's their property. So the long and short of it is the process is all spelled out within the zoning ordinance, but there are certain criteria that each of our local historic districts needs to satisfy in order to be considered eligible. And then the Historical Affairs Board, our Preservation Commission, plays a large part in that process and makes recommendations. And then those recommendations ultimately go to both the Planning Commission and the County Board.
And that is also true for county-owned land.
Yes, and there's a process, a few years ago, if any of you are familiar with Dorothyham Middle School, there was a process to designate that school as one of our local historic districts. And so there's a separate process that is also spelled out in the ordinance for those properties that are owned or maintained by Arlington Public Schools.
Did that also come up with the former headquarters of the
Oh, for the education center?
Ed Center, yeah.
Yes, that was a request that we did a few years ago, but the county board opted not to have that designated. But we have been able to successfully partner with Arlington Public Schools on the renovation that was done. And I think they, hope you would agree, they've done a marvelous job with an adaptive reuse of that very creative modern building.
Yes, heartily agree.
Yes.
I have another question, going to the contentious things. Two of them occurred in my civic association when I was the civic association president. So will somebody who is not a property owner still able to nominate something for consideration for a
Yes.
historic?
Yes, that's still part of the process.
Because I mean, there were two that were very contentious, but we succeeded, and both things have been the old Ed Center.
Mhm.
Yes, I mean, which is beautiful.
You don't have to be a property owner to nominate, but it is recommended that nominators who don't own a property really try to work with the property owner or let us talk to the property owner to start to build some relationship, a trust, being able to explain what this means, what it doesn't mean. So it's not impossible to do it. It does make it a little stickier.
Well, it was difficult. Those of us who were in favor of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, wasn't the,
And the Ball Family Cemetery there was part of the Methodist Church on,
Right.
Stewart,
right on,
Fairfax.
right.
That was a huge fight. And finally, the family came out. And when the family came out, that's when everybody was like, okay.
Right, so they're sorry, even though it's being built around,
Yes.
or even over. Because I remember this when my first planning commission meetings was all family.
Back in the day.
Didn't statute tighten up a bit though on who could nominate or how that worked?
That's why I asked.
So,
Yeah.
Yes, so you don't, like I said, you don't have to be a property owner to designate or nominate something, I should say. And then if there is a multifamily properties or if it's more than one building, there is a new stipulation in the nomination process that you need to have a minimum amount of support
that's
to
what-
bring that
That's,
question
minimum.
forward.
that's the change.
And is that what is a minimum amount of support? Is there specific things that tell you what the minimum is?
Yes, I believe it's 25%
That's fine, as long as it's.
of the property owners. So if it was a neighborhood, for example, you would need 1/4 of people to be at least entertaining the idea for it to continue. Mr. Chair, there's another question.
Yes. Okay.
It's a quick question, and I apologize for my lack of knowledge on this. Would the same also be true for a county-owned land?
Yes, so there's a few properties that the county owns that are protected as local districts. I'm not going to remember the name because it's changed, but the former Arlington Art Center has a new name now,
Right.
Mocha, I believe.
One of
That's a county-owned property, and so that is protected. So whenever there's changes that need to be made, whether for maintenance or other ongoing things, we work with our cohorts and DPS to make sure those changes are compatible.
What if one is not sort of protected at the time? Can the neighbors actually sort of nominate or petition or lobby in some way for it to be considered?
Let me make sure I understand your question. So if a property is not protected now, could neighbors lobby for it? The answer to that is yes. There, like I said, in the zoning ordinance, the nomination process is spelled out. But we found that it's more successful if concerned neighbors come to our staff first to express their desires and their motivations and what they're hoping to achieve. So then we can be working with them and approaching property owners. Because when property owners are caught in the dark, that tends to lead to complicated requests. And perhaps that's all I'll say about that.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other comments? People?
Guess if I could get a slight clarification, you mentioned that the incident at the
Febreze.
that somehow was a positive thing.
That was a tearing down of
No.
the raising consciousness.
Yes.
Right.
Deal with this.
Right.
Yes.
The tearing down of it was not the positive part of it, but I think the fact that the contentiousness of that nomination and how it played out over the year or so that it did,
It raised awareness.
it raised awareness, not only I think within the community, but also for us as staff who manage this designation process. And it really allowed us to think, well, what works well and what didn't work so well here and how can we improve that? So I think the fact that that happened during our 4-year planning study that we've been doing was the positive part of it, because it allowed us to go through that and think about ways to improve.
Yeah, Leah, this was our Pennsylvania station.
Yeah, I know.
Yes.
I was very frustrated.
It's very
too, but
Right.
I was trying to really absorb your positive outlook.
She said,
So I'll try to learn.
a while to get there.
I'm trying to learn off what else you say that way.
Okay, I think that would be it for this topic. Do we have any public speakers on this? Anybody interested? Yeah.
No, we do not have.
Okay, great. Then we can move right on to the Forestry and Natural Resources Plan update. It's all yours now.
Great. Let me pull up our slides and I will get started. I apologize in advance for it being a little bit longer than Cynthia's presentation, so we'll go on as you will.
And remember tonight, we can go to 9:30. That was announced. So, and earlier, that's okay, but we do have time.
Great. So good evening and thanks again for taking the time to be with me tonight. My name is Ryan Delaney. I'm a planner with EPR and I'm the project manager for the Forestry and Natural Resources Plan update, which for brevity's sake, I'll refer to as the FNRP from here on in. So the last time we met with you all back in October of 2022, we had just released the preliminary draft. And we had just concluded our first round of public engagement on the document. We also agreed to come back to you all after our next draft went out for engagement to provide an update. So with the publication of that updated draft this summer, we wanted to take this opportunity to give you a bit of a reorientation to the plan, a status update as we move forward towards the conclusion of the process. So tonight I'll be walking you all through the public feedback we received on the plan in 2022, right before we met with you all, the edits we made in response to that right after we met with you all, and then give you a bit of an overview of our most recent round of engagement and the edits we're going to make to the draft in response to that as we move towards adoption at the end of the year, ideally, before turning it back to you all for your discussion. So, like I said, it's been almost a year since we last met. So where exactly are we in this process? And as I said, we've just concluded our information gathering and briefings phase seen here to the left of the orange arrow. Public engagement on the most recent draft included an online engagement forum, in-person open house, which was our first in-person meeting of this process since it was kind of all contained within the COVID footprint, and then several commission briefings over the summer beginning on July 1st. We spent the rest of the summer analyzing feedback and are currently working on finalizing our RTA draft. So looking forward, we're targeting our request to advertise this October and ideally bringing the draft before the board this winter, hopefully in December. So that's where we are today. But before we catch you all up on the last two rounds of engagement and all the edits and changes the plan has gone through, I wanted to put on pause and provide a quick reorientation of what exactly is in the document. So as you all may remember, the FNRP updates and replaces both the Urban Forest Master Plan and the Natural Resources Management Plan. These were both sub-elements of the Public Spaces Master Plan. The FNRP is a combined document that is now its own element of the comprehensive plan. So this is the first time we're really, from a planning perspective at least, looking at all of our natural resources from a sort of an ecosystem level perspective and interconnected approach that covers not only the natural areas in the county and the sort of and aspects of the urban forest, the public right of way, but also the built environment and on private property as well. So the plan was kind of designed to reflect this and highlight those interconnections across all of our policy areas and other elements of the comprehensive plan and other county plans and programs. So right here on the slide, we're highlighting the strategic directions, which are the broad policy areas that form the framework for the plan's guidance. The structure and general intent of these hasn't changed since we last spoke, but they've all seen several refinements that we'll get into as we kind of move through the presentation this evening. Each of those strategic directions are supported by action steps, which are the smaller kind of operational planning tasks that we can take to move the policy goals forward. And in the current draft, there's 84. So 84 individual recommendations kind of within this framework. And so those strategic directions are the core of the plan. They're introduced by the executive summary, introduction and planning context sections, supported by an implementation framework and appendices. So before I dive into the recap, any questions on the structure, form, or the broad content? Great. So to ground the discussion of how we developed the plan and this most recent version, I wanted to briefly summarize the highlights of public comments on the preliminary draft that we received in the summer of 2022. So shortly before we met with you all, as I mentioned, we had a 2-month engagement period on that first draft of the FNRP. We were able to report out on some of the statistics and high-level findings when we met with you all, but we were still analyzing the feedback, hadn't gotten really into the details of editing the draft. So I wanted to start here. So at a high level, most folks were pleased with the draft. They felt that the actions under the strategic directions as a whole supported the county's vision for its forests and natural resources, and that the vision the plan articulated was the right one. And that said, then we also got a lot of constructive feedback, and that fell into the themes on the slide here, including more urgency in tone and content, especially around climate issues, making equity core to all the elements of the plan, measurable goals, metrics, and implementation. If you all remember the preliminary draft did not have the implementation framework in it. That was in part deliberate to try to get folks' input, but they picked up on that, which was great. And then deeper, more creative thinking about land use, possible incentives, and educational efforts. And lastly, several comments around setting a more ambitious goal for tree canopy than 40% countywide. So with those themes in mind, I'd like to walk through some of the changes we made based on this feedback in 2022 and early 2023. Those changes fell into these 3 buckets that I'll briefly summarize. We added a new executive summary to the intro and made edits to reflect comments on urgency, tone, and the existing conditions. We made changes to some of our existing recommendations and introduced several new ones in the strategic directions, which I'll go over in more detail. And then lastly, there were some significant changes in structure and format. If you all remember that preliminary draft that was out right before we met with you all was essentially a Word document. It was the text of the plan. It was some initial preliminary maps and figures. We really wanted to get a gut check from the community on our approach and the general policy direction before we solidified it or made it something a little bit harder to change. So we incorporated maps, graphics, and charts. We strengthened the action verbs and cross-references in the recommendations, both within the plan and across the rest of the comp plan elements. And most importantly, this new draft included an implementation plan and a draft of our priority actions, so kind of a selection of 10 of the highest priority recommendations in the plan. So in addressing those comments, we were really striving to satisfy some of our respondents' desires for more specific, targeted operational content, with the fact that as an element of the comprehensive plan, as Cynthia articulated so well earlier, the FNRP needs to be sort of a high-level, flexible document that's fluid enough to serve as a guide for the county's environmental policy into an uncertain future, as unpleasant as that may be to think. I'm going to go over some of those changes that we made in the strategic directions and the recommendations, and hopefully that helps illustrate our approach to this process. So I'll start at the top with SD1, and this is the part where y'all can feel free to bring me along if we go too deep into the weeds. But as I mentioned, some of our comments indicated that 40% canopy coverage was countywide was not ambitious enough. Well, we believe that's an appropriate countywide goal based on our analysis of plantable space and existing condition. We did add specificity, calling out local conditions and ecology, the historical inequity of where that tree canopy is distributed across the county, and created closer cross-references to our tree equity goals. We also included these two new action steps on the slide, 1.1.2 and 1.1.3, that further refined that goal and hopefully helps guide implementation. So in prior versions of the draft, the preliminary draft, we did not have a goal for forest health or ecological function to go along with that numerical canopy coverage goal, which is why we included the native tree canopy recommendation. We also didn't have strong guidance for public sites and how they could contribute to that overall countywide goal, so we included that in 1.1.3, both for APS sites and for county parks. 1.2.4 and 1.2.5 were added to make the commitment to creating more space for trees and natural resources more specific. And then 1.2.6 was added to track with the then current conversation about county's weed ordinance and updating the condition of private property section of the county ordinance. Other smaller changes included updates to existing recommendations about land acquisition to make it clear that even small acquisition opportunities for natural resource purposes, like the recent DES micro reforestation projects, are worthwhile goals and help contribute to some of the overall policy goals in the FNRP, and to pursue bringing forested APS lands into county management for more consistency in forestry and conservation operations kind of across the two entities. We also added this section explaining what biophilic design is to SD1. Similar to the casual use space guidance in the public spaces master plan, if you all are familiar with that, we essentially got a lot of feedback in that preliminary draft, particularly from commission members. That guidance on what constitutes biophilic design, what the county means when we're asking for it, would be really helpful with SPRCs and other project reviews. So we added this supplement to SD1, where most of our development-related recommendations live. It's not a formal design checklist or manual, but we really felt that the FNRP's role could be to better illustrate what the county means when we talk about biophilic design. And we did that by sharing not just some text, but also hopefully some more interesting photos of successful projects from the private sector, but also school sites, parks, and streetscapes across the county. Moving to strategic direction 2, action step 2.1.1, which is our primary tree equity recommendation, was enhanced with some preliminary GIS analysis identifying several neighborhoods that are currently underserved by trees and green infrastructure. We also explicitly made this recommendation a prioritization measure for that 40% countywide tree canopy goal and cross-referenced it with some of our operational recommendations about reporting on progress towards the plan's goals. And then the major update to strategic direction 3 was the addition of recommendations regarding use of native plants, essentially adopting a native plant requirement for public and private sites to kind of expand the logical function of our landscaping and make space for threatened native plants. We currently follow a native plant preferred policy for public sites. This is really meant to take that, make the requirement, make it broader. And it was accompanied by an appendix kind of detailing what that policy may look like once we get to the adoption phase as a little bit of a kickstart to implementation. So we don't have to start from zero after the plan is adopted. And then strategic direction 4 was streamlined a bit, but remained essentially the same. The only one that we really wanted to focus on was expanding 4.1.4. Previously in the preliminary draft, a really narrow recommendation about reporting on tree loss annually to be a more a broader recommendation to report on plan implementation progress over the years. As I mentioned, we also included the implementation plan. This follows the format of a lot of our comp plan elements and sector plans. So if you're familiar with the PSMP, depending on city sector plan, really similar format. High-level details about planning level cost estimates, potential partners, which county agencies are the leads, potential funding sources, that sort of thing, to help frame how we're going to accomplish this for folks who are reading the plan and future staff. And that leads us to the last aspect that we added to the plan, which were the priority actions. So this is an initial selection of 10 that were compiled by the project team and selected to emphasize major changes that the FNRP recommends over current county practice, to highlight our equity recommendations, to elevate actions that staff, particular subject matter experts in DES and Parks and Natural Resources, felt would be the most impactful conservation actions, and to reflect, most importantly, what we learned through community engagement about where the people of Arlington's priorities lie in the sea of 84 recommendations. And so in the interest of preserving some discussion time, I won't read through all of these, but these are the first 5. They're in the draft. Hopefully they're somewhat familiar at this point. And these are our last 5. Kind of a wide selection from across the plan with a focus on SD1, which is kind of foundational, creating space for all of this stuff that we want to see. All right, so that brings you all up to speed on how we arrived at the draft, most recent draft that we released in July of this year. Our engagement period on this draft lasted 30 days, focused really on, rather than a sort of a broad call for priorities, what folks want to see in their environmental policies, and, you know, kind of that more of a brainstorming call for engagement, really wanted to focus in on folks' level of satisfaction with the plan as amended, assessing how well we captured their feedback on the last version, and really trying to understand, in particular, how members of the public wanted to be involved with achieving the vision that the FNRP lays out. So in reading through the plan, I hope it comes through, but because of a lot of the limitations we have in terms of the fill-in rule and some of the other, you know, just like the immense cost of a lot of this, these actions, and the prevalence of private property and where tree canopy can go, we framed the FNRP as sort of a community-wide community conservation plan. And so this was our first real opportunity to check in with the public and understand how they want to plug into that work. So this round consisted of an online comment form as well as an in-person open house that I mentioned earlier. It delivered a little over 150 participants and 415 comments this time around. That's down a bit from our broader initial engagement on the preliminary draft, but kind of exceeds our expectations for this stage, where instead of, hey, what do you all think about the environment? It's, hey, read this 180-page document and tell us where we went wrong. So we're pretty enthusiastic about the level of feedback, the thoroughness of the comments, and the general level of engagement that greeted the new draft. And it seems like the respondents were too. So again, the majority of folks this time around were neutral to very satisfied with the current draft, and digging into the open-ended comments that accompanied this sort of numerical feedback. The majority of the folks in the neutral and dissatisfied bucket of responses included support for the plan's visions and goals and constructive criticism of how to improve it. So less, you all are wrong, and more, we like where you're going, go further, in terms of the feedback that we got at a high level on the draft. So that generally shows us that we're on the right track, and that maybe we have some work to do to strengthen some of the recommendations moving That, we saw similar results regarding the implementation framework, with some suggestions about how to improve that aspect of the plan. For example, level of detail regarding partners and potential funding sources. Really, folks wanted to see how the rubber met the road, but was generally on board with the approach of our implementation framework. And then one of the more exciting questions this round, like I mentioned, this is centered on sort of a community-wide approach to conservation. We wanted to see how folks wanted to plug into that. And the level of response we got was really encouraging and helps us kind of understand how post-adoption we can fold implementation of a lot of the FNRP's recommendations, particularly around private property, volunteer organizations, and education and outreach into some of the programming that DPR and DES do. So that was kind of a fun one for us to see how folks wanted to contribute. And so, you know, those are the stats, but what did we actually hear this time around? Across all of the engagement mechanisms that I mentioned, these are the top themes that we heard this summer. Again, strong support for the vision and recommendations in the draft, and the sort of a majority consensus that the comments were adequately reflected in the new version of the draft. However, we were seeing continued support for more specific goals, metrics, and implementation measures, as well as a more urgent tone in the narrative that sort of resurfaced from last year. Also strong feedback that existing efforts and volunteer groups needed to be included in more detail, both in the introduction and the existing conditions, to kind of explain both how we got to where we are today and create a better foundation for the recommendations, and to be more directly integrated into those recommendations, particularly in SDs 3 and 4, where we talk a lot about private conservation and volunteer orgs. And then lastly, strong interest in how respondents could support the goals of the plan, either in their own yards or through civic engagement, that sort of thing, volunteer programs, education, outreach. And so that's how the current draft was received, at least at a high level. We will be doing a deeper dive into the engagement feedback at the Natural Resources Joint Advisory Group meeting on Monday. So if anybody wants to get more into the weeds on that, please feel free to tune in. But over the last several weeks, we've been working on draft edits to respond to this feedback, which I'd like to share a selection to kind of indicate our thinking on how best to improve the draft as we move towards the RTA. We're still working, so these aren't final, and this list isn't exhaustive either. So with that preface aside, definitely would welcome any thoughts you all have this evening. We're moving forward as we move towards finalizing this next iteration of the draft. So for the intro material, which includes the executive summary, planning context, we're considering kind of how best to highlight racial equity and environmental justice, particularly in the executive summary. So it's right up front. It is throughout the plan, but comments indicated it was sort of lost in the introduction. How we can increase a sense of urgency, particularly in regards to climate in the introduction, without kind of tipping the balance towards despair and causing inaction. So that sort of classic climate communications dilemma. We also wanted to include cross-references to the Historic and Cultural Resources Plan, particularly as it relates to natural history of Arlington in our introduction, particularly in regards to Native American history in the county. We also want to expand the discussion of by right development in the planning context to better frame up a lot of the recommendations around conservation in the built environment in Strategic Direction 1. And we want to add a new section on environmental organizations and volunteer groups to existing conditions. As I mentioned earlier, not just to address the comments, but also because thinking it through over the last 3 years, it's a much better foundation for a lot of the recommendations we have later in the plan. We also will be clarifying discussion of tree canopy decline and adding references to both the Tree Canopy Fund and the Tree Canopy Equity Program to existing conditions, and adding detail to both the existing conditions and the discussion of trends of other non-tree species of flora and fauna, really to create more parity with the discussion about tree canopy and strengthen the narrative connections between different aspects of the ecosystem. Remember way back that these were 2 separate plans that we're trying to integrate. This was one of the ways we want to make that connection clearer. And then finally, we heard several comments about how better organized and easier to read summary at the top of the plan would be really helpful. So we're intending to reorganize the executive summary, the introduction to the strategic directions, and the priority action section to make a more concise and easier to understand digest of the FNRP that hopefully folks like you all, like the board who have to use this moving forward as a decision-making tool, have a more narratively complete quick reference guide to the policy recommendations. And then moving into the actual recommendations themselves, like I mentioned, we received a ton of comments about the strength of the plan's language. Now, a lot of that is most likely the result of the FNRP being a comp plan element rather than like an operational document like a department word plan or a resource management plan for a particular parcel. And thus needing to be kind of at that 60,000 foot level and maybe a little bit more flexible. But we are going through the draft again to see where more generic action verbs like explore can be pulled out in favor of more descriptive active language that better aligns with the recommendations themselves. For example, research, compare, evaluate, to make it clear that the county's committed to action, even if adopting the FNRP doesn't automatically change anything in the zoning ordinance or other regulations or policies directly. We also want to reflect the clarifications that we made to the introduction and existing conditions regarding tree canopy decline, clarifying that the tree canopy goal in SD1 that we need to reestablish 40% tree canopy, acknowledging that we've declined below that likely in the last several years, and that we added a framing on the recommendation of the Forestry and Natural Resources Commission to explicitly state that this is the floor, not the ceiling. So it now reads, reestablish and maintain at least 40% tree canopy rather than establish and maintain 40% tree canopy. Or in an earlier version, even maintain 40% tree canopy based on our existing conditions analysis. So we're also working on specific recommendations to include tree canopy and other vegetated cover targets in sector plans and similar county planning efforts, very like what we did in the Pentagon City sector plan, for example, but making that kind of table stakes for future planning processes. Also looking at incorporating specific recommendations to underground utilities to avoid tree impacts in response to public concerns that we heard this summer. Expanding our references to existing partnerships and volunteer organizations. Really an acknowledgement that my initial approach of focusing only on what to do moving forward to kind of enhance our community engagement broadly with these issues left a lot of really good work unsung and is ultimately a weaker foundation for the plan's community-wide approach to conservation than being more explicit and calling out our existing partners and adding that acknowledgement piece back in. And we'll also be revisiting the language in 2.1.1 to make it clear that the next steps are outreach to these impacted communities to understand how we can help improve things on the ground rather than more analysis to identify where those communities that are impacted by lack of tree canopy are. We've done that analysis. It's represented in the document. We wanted to be crystal clear in the language there. And then in SD4, the last handful of these, really further refining 4.1.4 to reflect our commitment to tracking, reporting on implementation of the plan broadly, not just in specific buckets like tree canopy or tree equity. Adding relevant information from the ongoing deer browse impact study to 4.1.8 to replace the small placeholder that we had in the draft for that study to kind of progress and deliver some results that we can incorporate. And then ensuring our volunteer recommendations in action 4.3 reflected that new focus on our existing partnerships, programs, and recent successes. So that's a selection of the deeper edits that we're working on. We're also considering other smaller ones, like adding more detail to the implementation matrix, particularly around potential partners for some of these implementation items, increasing cross-references throughout the plan to other county comp plan elements. And of course, if you all read this even remotely closely, catching all of the typos and confusing elements of layout and language that folks commented on as we brought the draft forward this past summer. So there's a humbling mea culpa involved in some of these edits that has nothing to do with policy, which I'm both thankful and chagrined. So hopefully that's a bit of a window into the plan's development process and helps you all understand not just how we arrived at this most recent draft this summer, but where we're going moving forward and how we intend to incorporate this most recent round of feedback as we prepare to bring the plan forward for adoption. In terms of when we're going there, like I said, we're in the midst of incorporating all of this feedback into our new draft. The immediate next steps are obviously to finalize this RTA draft and prepare for the RTA next month in October. And then, as I said earlier, we're ultimately aiming to bring the draft before the board this winter. Ideally, it would be December. We'll see how October goes. But that concludes the staff presentation. Happy to yield the rest of the time back to you all for discussion. I'm here to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you very much. It's now at the table. So Commissioner Magley.
I do have a question. So I'm assuming that you're aware of FNR's and PRC's letters.
Yes.
Okay. So when you're saying that you are continually looking at updating and things, are you addressing yet some of the things? Both seem to be supportive, but still feel that there's fine tuning that needs to be done. And those, what you've just gone through, I can see not exact references, but so you are sensitive to it and you are incorporating still their concerns?
We are, yeah.
Okay.
Those commission letters have been immensely helpful. And just as a point of process, and I believe Bill Winglehopper is on the line as well, so feel free to jump in if I mischaracterize, Bill. The Natural Resources Joint Advisory Group is sort of our oversight for this plan. That includes representatives from FNRC, PRC, C2E2. So we meet with them regularly and have been discussing not just the formal feedback in the letter, but moving forward and backwards and side to side, all of the feedback that those commissions have been discussing. Now, I'm sure Phil could attest that we're probably not going to be able to act on all of it, but that has been a significant sort of guide to those edits that I just articulated. Yes.
I recognize some of them from the letters and I thought, no, I'm assuming that you've seen those and that this is part of that discussion.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Good, thank you, because I wanted to make sure that was raised. Thank you, Commissioner Bagley. Other comments? I want to acknowledge that Commissioner Peterson is here also.
I have a few, I think.
She's first.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I mean, I got here late, so I,
No, I insist.
Okay.
well, I apologize for
Sorry.
being late. It was APS back to school night, so I had to attend that first. So you mentioned that the Dillon rule limits your ability to implement some of the community's requests or maybe some of your interests in kind of making Arlington greener. Do you all have a list of legislative priorities where if the state gave Arlington more local authority that, your laundry list of like, here's what we would do?
We do. In the context of the plan, it's action step 1.2.1 that articulates kind of at a high level what those needs are. On a more operational kind of day-to-day level, we meet more or less annually with the legislative affairs team to, make sure that those priorities are current and that we're tracking any potential legislation that would be helpful in addressing some of those. So we do have in the document that the full text of it is seek legislative changes at the state level that provide Arlington County with a broader set of policy tools to promote the conservation and management of its natural resources. That is one of our 10 priority actions as well. So it's top of mind, particularly around sort of the ability to exceed some of the state regulations for requirements for tree canopy, but several other things as well. And we have that in there. That is obviously part of our program. The rest of the plan is also predicated on should those things not come to pass at the state level, how do we address these challenges on private property? And we do that by trying to establish that sort of community-wide approach, incentives, education, outreach, even down into the minutia in 1.2.3 of looking at new ways to think about things like lot coverage, by right development, what our tools are with special exception development as well. And some of the recent county planning, like the Pentagon City Sector Plan, and the site plans coming in under that are some of the examples of things that we're trying to look at. Should we, tilted windmills in Richmond in years to
Well, so it's probably useful for our commission to have that list as well as other plans lists for when we're asked what, we think the county legislative package should look like when we're going to Richmond to lobby and, things that our commission thinks are also important. We can add that to our list.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. We'll go to first Commissioner Gearin online, then Commissioner Sarley here, then Mr. Klinghoffer online. So first, Commissioner Gearin.
Great. Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, I want to say, Ryan, thank you very much. The plan looks really good, and I feel like it gets stronger all the time. I'm sure there are still some things that that we need to address, but I want to align myself with our colleagues on FNRC and PRC and their letters, which support the plan, but stress the urgency to adopt and implement the plan and ensure that it is consistent and coordinated with the other comp plan components, including things like stormwater master plan, community energy plan, and so on. And likewise, I share the concerns that have been raised over the reviews, like Nia raised, and in the letters about the threat from climate change and development to the value trees in the parks. And I like that we have the state level legislative changes as a priority. So I mean, a lot of the things I'm saying, my comments I made before I saw your presentation. So I'm really heartened to hear a lot of that. I think we do need more policy tools to guide our planning and development and to let us as our own jurisdiction try to balance our natural resources with the demand for more dense development. And I feel confident we can do that. I like that the vision statement acknowledges the importance of creating resilience in the face of climate change. I feel like that is a great example of how this has evolved to be really current. I concur that with the priority actions about acquiring the open space and public space, and I'm not sure if there's already a corresponding piece in there that ties this to set aside funding, because that's been something that we've talked about since I was on Park and Rec at least 15 years ago now. We need to have money set aside specifically for that, the way we do for affordable housing. And it would be nice if we did this, if we targeted the way we do for tree canopy fund to areas of equity. I also hope that as we move the plan forward, that we are able to take the metrics that we're starting to see in there and use them not only to show our progress in meeting our goals, but maybe some of the benefits that we get to our health and our ecosystem out of these changes and these improvements. And then I just have a couple of questions. I know that earlier iterations, Ryan, were fairly silent on the volunteer activity in groups. And has that been expanded a bit? Because it's such a big component of the work that's done in the parks. To remove invasives and engage the public around it and show up at the county fair and talk about removing ivy from the trees. I mean, some of that went through Armin, some of it through Master Gardeners, through tree stewards. And then my last question was, I was kind of curious about what were the concerns of the 24% who said they were dissatisfied with the plan. So thank you.
Sure. To the first question, I have kind of a summary level yes, the short yes to your question about incorporating volunteers and other environmental organization partners into the plan. The longer answer is in a handful of places, we've added a summary of the sort of groups and organizations and the types of work that they do into the people section of existing conditions up front in the plan, and added or will be adding a sort of summary appendix that kind of gets a little bit more into the mission statement of the snapshot of organizations we're currently working with to try to make sure that they're to add that more explicit recognition piece, but then also throughout the recommendations in particularly SD 1 and 4, where we reference volunteer groups or partnerships or MOUs to be a little bit more explicit about what we're already doing and who we're doing that with, and using that as kind of the foundation for some of those recommendations. So a handful of text changes to the recommendations, but more importantly, I think that new section in the introduction about existing conditions and who's contributing to this work moving forward. Yeah, and then to your second question, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, we'll be diving into this a little bit more deeply on Monday evening, but I think the majority of those comments about folks, the open-ended comments, folks who are kind of dissatisfied with where we are, it was tone, / urgency. It was to be more explicit and specific with implementation strategies or metrics and things of that nature that unfortunately kind of fall outside of the purview of a comprehensive plan element to address fully. And then some not legacy comments, but consistent comments that we've been getting throughout the process about whether or not 40% tree canopy is the correct goal, if it's ambitious enough. So folks wanting to see a higher target, more targets, and more specificity than we would typically get into in a comprehensive plan. So a lot of those are really constructive and helpful. And a lot of them would be if this was a more operational plan, and those are things that we can take kind of into our administrative record and think through as we go through sort of our implementation strategies, and certainly as we move into our next tree canopy study. But they're probably not things that we can address directly in the draft.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, can I follow up on something?
Yes, you can.
Thank you. Ryan, what do you think about this idea of using the metrics, though, to help explain maybe like why this is so important? So if we can show these extra trees add to greater carbon sequestration, greater erosion control, this green infrastructure here, helps this much with supporting our aging gray infrastructure, so that we use the metrics not only to show our progress towards meeting our goals, but as almost an educational tool to build more support for this going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's ways we're doing that now, particularly around the tree equity metrics and the native tree canopy addition in the latest round. But I will definitely try to think on more ways that we can incorporate some of the numerical targets into that aspirational or educational piece.
Thank you. I really think it's a great plan. You guys have done a great job. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Sarli, and then Mr. Klinghoffer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think I will echo Commissioner Garrett's comments that the plan's really great. I particularly appreciated that you approached us with the Word document. That was very refreshing in a way. We did feel like we could comment, and I appreciate sort of the process being very welcoming to the comments of the community in general. So thanks for that. I'm going to follow a little bit on Commissioner Peterson's idea of legislating and take it more towards the incentive towards development. I'd love to see a little bit more emphasis, or perhaps highlight the idea of creating some sort of, and I don't think I saw anything on here. I was looking for it. Somehow of a trade, with private developers to preserve essentially existing canopy. And one of the things that I think of is perhaps staff would have either assist or have some sort of a guidance for setback zoning. What's the word I'm looking for? I always blank out. Variances, right? So like, for instance, a homeowner wants to add an addition to their house, but there's like a really great, mini micro forest, I think is the term you used, which I really like, but it's a really onerous process to create a zoning variance, to apply for variance. So if we can somehow incentivize or create a situation where trees are, high priority and facilitates that process.
Sure. Yeah. I think, I should put it this way. We have tried to do that specifically in 1.2.3, where we talk about, particularly under special exception development, we talk about building density and height, or in sort of an exchange for more planted space or conservation. I think a lot of that's inspired by the approach we took in the Pentagon City Sector Plan, looking at some of the potential conservation areas that might manifest on River House should it come forward for redevelopment. So that was sort of the inspiration there. We've tried to have that we've tried to have the FNRP, particularly Action 1.2, queue up a lot of those things around setbacks, around building height, around kind of table setting for future special exception development in particular, queued up by this document for that conversation around lot coverage, setbacks, and things like that we will need to have should we any zoning ordinance updates.
Okay, those are great, but I think with a slight little nuance that I'm trying to, it's like almost at the residential level, so that homeowners can also have an easier time, right? Not a free pass, but an easier time to ask for variance so that we incentivize them building in areas that are more conducive. The other comment that I had was incentives. Oh, the DES, and this is a little bit about sort of having staff communicate, interdepartmental communication, right? This is about incentivizing staff to make that process easier. So the other one that I had was the conversation with DES and underground utilities, which I did see that you have. But again, you know, a lot of, like, every time I drive by that like fleet of Asplin trucks and they're going, you know, sort of, they're not the best tree pruners around these high level, high power lines. Anything that we can do to sort of advance undergrounding, you know, and bring that to the front. And again, I'm not saying that that's missing on here. But, you know, if we can perhaps highlight that a little bit more. I think that's it. That's all I have for now.
Thank you. And Mr. Klinghoffer, your turn.
Thank you very much for giving me a chance to talk about this plan to you all. I'll represent the FNRC, Forestry and Natural Resource Commission, FNRC's views on these things. This plan is something that I've been working closely with Ryan for really over 2 years. One thing I wanted to say about the current version is this current version is something that was very well received by the FNRC. In fact, it includes many of the previous recommendations, which showed us what a good job Ryan and his colleagues have done to be open to ideas and ways of changing the plan. So the plan itself has been a fluid document, but getting better and more powerful with each rendition. I don't want to repeat some of the things that Eleanor was just talking about, but I suspect that some of the people in that 25% who were not pleased with the plan were folks who thought that again, we're looking for that sense of urgency. Arlington values its parks, trees, and neighborhoods, and all of them are under threat, not just from one peril, but from two relentless forces, climate change and development. And these challenges are real and immediate and existential, in that what's not sufficiently protected, conserved, and restored will undoubtedly be lost. And it's clear to the commission that this urgency is needed to push the outcomes, the benefits from this plan, so that they can happen in time to prevent loss of what natural resources we have. It's under pressure from all sources. It can still be saved. What I'd like to do is,
Mr. Klinghoffer, there's something wrong with your sound. Are you moving something around on your computer? It's interfering with us hearing you.
thank you for telling me that. Is this better?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I apologize. I'm not going to repeat it because you probably got enough of my gist. You've also had probably a long second night of meetings. First, I just want to point out two things that I think are important for your commission to be involved with. And the first one is the lot coverage. In the last year, with the missing middle and expanding housing option proposals, there has been a lot of focus on lot coverage as those proposals were being developed. But the truth of the matter is that single residential homes are just as dangerous to our tree canopy in the future if hardscape is allowed to expand until there's really no room for the trees and other plantings to survive on the properties. We need to have space for nature, and that's an important step that I hope this plan will push forward, but I hope Arlington policies will also move it in the right direction. A second area of focus that I think is important is the site plan conditions under SPRC. It's critical that we have an integrated, updated process that the developers can have access to, be advised of as they're preparing their very initial documents and as plans are being made, so that they know that we want them to include biophilic design, for example, or landscaping needs to be integrated with the very early designs that the companies, the developers are bringing so that the costs of the increment of these changes really fits nicely within the budget if it's planned for from the beginning. The commissioners are enthusiastic in support of this plan. It represents a holistic recognition of the value of our space, our nature, and our future sustainability. And so we are supportive and urge that this plan be adopted when it comes to that point. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have for me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much. And I have some comments, questions, ideas. First of all, if I heard correctly, you're now working with APS to help manage their, because I know they have, there's that little forest by Williamsburg Middle School. So that's now county and APS working together on preserving those, or?
That we've been working, let me clarify from the perspective of the plan. We've been working with APS to include recommendations to kind of bring those forested parcels across the two public ownerships into more coherent management. So I do know my colleague Vincent works with them frequently in sort of more of a consulting role. The plan recommends a more formal relationship, pursuing either a transfer of management responsibility from APS to us in the case of certain contiguous forest parcels, but also working with them to set minimum tree canopy targets for new school sites moving forward. So that's kind of the context that we're working with APS on.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Strongly that, because that is not APS's core function and it's yours. So it'd make a huge amount of sense to do that. You know, they mentioned also that sector plans, this would be useful for sector plans going forward. Well, the last sector plan is kind of Leverdew is being completed now, Planks Boulevard. There'll be tweaks to all the sector plans going forward in the future, but this is like the last time we're going to have a from scratch document be created. So this is going to, you're going to have a way to influence the existing sector plans rather than new ones, which is going to happen. And
yeah,
maybe the language needs to be tweaked to take that into account, so that we can make, because even right now, you still have that opportunity for Planks Boulevard to maybe put in tree goals, that sort of thing. That is one of the components in there that I think needs to be strengthened. On the tree canopy, actually you said you're going to be doing a yearly report on the number of trees that come down, that sort of thing. That would be county-owned trees, because if a tree comes down on a private property, that's not, there's no permits required. The county doesn't know what happens.
Sure. Yeah. What we're actually proposing, that was sort of the original in the preliminary draft, that 4.1.4 was really narrow to like tree removals that the county was tracking. It's now we've updated that to essentially be a much broader annual report, whether that's through the Enerjag or through another mechanism, on plan implementation and any inventories or studies or assessments we're doing that year. There's a whole suite of tree and other natural resource inventories on sort of a staggered multi-annual basis that the plan recommends. So it would be, we're essentially recommending that we report out on whichever one is current that year at the annual report. So it's a broader and kind of more flexible recommendation. To your point, the difficulties of tracking every tree that comes down. You know, we may be able to get there, particularly through like the iTree Eco studies and some of the public science efforts that we have, but we wanted to really focus on the bigger picture and reporting on kind of the broader metrics in the plan.
Right. So certainly there's some way you can get a consistent way of reporting it, so we're always comparing apples to apples, trees to trees. You know, that you're not going to keep changing way of doing it. Sometimes it's a satellite image, sometimes it's going out and counting, doing a census. You know, you have to be able to be consistent and able to tell whether you're making progress or not. I think that's always one of the reasons why tree canopy coverage was so controversial, is that different people are using different organizations are using different ways of measuring it. And not surprisingly, the numbers come out different, even though it was the same thing. And we want to be able to focus on having more trees rather than arguing over how many there are.
Yeah, absolutely agree there. And even within our own studies, we've had versions of it that count DoD lands, for example, versus that don't. So even within our own metrics, we have two sets of statistics.
But that's another thing. We have so much land here that isn't our land. Do we include in our percentage the airport? Do we include the GRV Parkway? Do we include Arlington Cemetery? The DoD parking lots, all those included or not included? I think there should be at least some reference in there about how we deal with those non-Arlington owned, federal, essentially those federal properties.
Great point. I think we do have in the existing conditions a small table that tries to break that down, but I will take that feedback back to our urban forestry crew and see if there's any other detail that we can include in the existing conditions to kind of frame that up. I think the important thing, and the plan is predicated on this, and I know you all know this, so forgive me for getting on my soapbox, but because of the various methodologies and this sort of apples to oranges comparison, even within our own, we have our formal tree canopy studies. We also have our iTree eco reports, which incorporate, for example, the work done by the tree stewards. So there are various ways to measure this, to your point, like which of the federal or regional entities in the case of Nova Parks do we count? The important thing is that the data points generally agree that the trend is slightly downward. And so the plan is predicated on that. So I do want to just clarify that. But to your point about better articulation of the data points that make up that trend, I think that's really so good. I appreciate it.
When you within DES, there's also two little silos. And what I hope this plan does is help those silos start to integrate, because we have parks and recs, we have streets, we have stormwater people, and yet there's a component of what you do for all of those. We have way too much turf that's just there because we can't figure out what else to do with it. It's easy to mow, but part of your plan should be getting rid of turf that isn't being used for kids running around on, or a golf course or something. There's no, that should be forested or tree or rain gardens or something other than just grass. And if there's some way we can have that reflected in there, that all components of the county really need to be thinking about when you see grass, why is that there? Why do we still have some way to do that going forward? Because walking here, at 95-degree heat island is real. I can't remember to what extent, if all we do discuss heat island effect, other than trees are good to mitigate heat. This is becoming clearly more and more important. Grass doesn't help heat island much at all. Trees really, really do, as do other types of foliage. And, there should be a major component. Got to get rid of, it's not just get more trees, but get rid of turf where it is. But that requires all within DES to be coordinated with each other, rather than just by default, oh yeah, it's grass, so we can take care of that. It's easy to maintain.
Yeah.
So that's just thinking, I have something else, but you should understand something.
I had a follow-on comment. I remember at a board meeting once, county board member Karen Tonis joked that he had a natural lawn and his neighbors had filed a complaint to zoning because it was not allowed. So do you get into the details of looking into ways to make green lawn not the only option?
Yeah, I'll address that one first, and then come back to the broader point about turf grass. The short answer is yes. The current version has a recommendation to examine that portion of the county code, which is, we call it the weed ordinance. I believe it's actually called section 10.2, condition of private property. We actually just went to RTA for the update that would address that in July, I believe. And Jennifer Fioretti, who's on the line, can correct me if I'm wrong, that goes to the board in October. So obviously I don't have a crystal ball, but my hope is that we'll be able to remove that recommendation and replace it with a sidebar of an early victory in the next edition of the plan. So we do, that's something that FNRC and PRC and Enerjag have been on that beat for quite some time. And we're sort of catching up to some of the regulatory solutions that other Northern Virginia jurisdictions have implemented. So that's currently represented in the plan. My hope is that it will no longer be, because it will just be an existing condition. And then to the point about turf grass in particular, we do have a recommendation currently to examine how the prevalence of turf grass on public and private property impedes achievement of the FNRP's goals and related stormwater management goals. It does not explicitly reference urban heat island there, but because so much of strategic direction 2, our climate strategic direction, still can't say those in sequence quite well, is predicated on urban heat island, its intersection with obviously climate change, but also the tree equity scores, it's a component of that. It is implicitly referenced in that turf grass recommendation, but we can look at focusing that language a little bit more. And then to the point on silos, one of the things that's been really encouraging about this process is how deeply involved DES in particular, kind of across all of their different divisions and sections, has been in helping us draft this. So we've had folks from stormwater, folks from the air team, folks from down to bike and ped planners working with us on a lot of this, everywhere that we intersect stormwater, the public right of way, a lot of the green corridor recommendations in 3.3 were crafted with their help, kind of specifically to acknowledge that intersection of our responsibility and policy goals. So hopefully that's encouraging. I've been encouraged by it over the last couple of years. But, yeah, so.
And for your list of volunteer organizations, we can put a date on that that says information on volunteer organizations is current as of, say, January 2024, whenever the board votes on. So one thing that has always driven me crazy about comp plan opponents is they'll actually say, today we're looking at this, and plan has been in place for 5 years, so you have no idea what today means.
Yes.
So it should always refer to as of the date of this plan, which is somewhere, make it really clear. So January 2024, December 2023, when it's finally put to bed. So you'll have that sort of references. Okay, that's one of my pet peeves whenever I look at the comp plan elements.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And I did get a quick correction from Jennifer Fioretti. We go to the board in September for that change, not October.
Great.
Yeah, so
Wonderful.
great news.
First, Commissioner Guevara and then Commissioner Saul.
Well, thank you so much for the great overview. It's clear you guys have done a lot of work. Monitoring and evaluation is my love language, so I really don't envy you when it comes to the tracking and reporting. It seems like a lot of the comments you received back were qualitative in nature, right? Which can sometimes be subjective. What is urgency and how do you communicate that? The 40% figure, obviously that's more quantitative and that's sort of easier to measure. But given that there's been some satisfaction and that there's been some sort of, unclear which method you're following and how you're evaluating, do you think it would be helpful to have clear output and outcome indicators?
More clear in what sense?
In the sense that they're being communicated further out so that, benchmarking and whether you're meeting the intended goals is clearer so that there's not so much confusion as to.
Yeah, I do think so. We've tried to do that within the confines of this sort of comp planning box that we're in. So we have these several numeric targets that I mentioned, what the 40% goal, which admittedly folks aren't, not everybody is on board with that target, even though we feel that's the best and what our analysis has yielded. Similarly, we've incorporated in this last round or the previous round of that, it's the 70% native tree species in our tree canopy, which is another sort of by 2035, again, like long-term planning benchmarks, but I think helpful guideposts. Where we feel the rubber meets the road in this regard is in strategic direction 4, where we have sort of explicit recommendations to do more regular inventorying of more things. So we have better up-to-date sort of snapshots of our progress towards these broad goals. And then to beef up that sort of annual reporting aspect, which can take many forms, a written report to the board, briefing to our oversight committee, that sort of thing. We've also talked about ways that we can be more proactive about sharing that information, an overhaul of the aspect of the county's website that deals with some of this stuff. We have a lot of these things out there in different places, but there are the
Consolidating.
yeah, and so looking into that. So I think we're in sort of the enviable position of having a lot of good data, having an understanding of where we need better data, and already having some of the communication tools. But I feel like a lot of where we need to go moving forward with communication based on what we were hearing is to just be more consistent and creative with how we're communicating that data and more consistent or more frequent as well. So.
And I think that would address Commissioners Garrett's concern about just being able to tell the narrative and sort of communicating that to the public. I think would be really cool. But I'm glad you guys are taking steps to address that, and hopefully consolidating all the different assets will be helpful in moving forward.
We're trying. We hope it works.
Oh, that's right, I forgot. I want to associate myself with Commissioner Golentelme's silo concern. And just anecdotally, this was more than 10 years ago, if I recall correctly. You know, we were doing a community center that has a park associated with it, and they asked us to tear down like 12 to 15 mature trees because the slope of the park needed to be, mitigated because of runoff. Unfortunately, that died really quickly. But I think this idea of educating, your peers and making sure that they understand that trees are more valuable for stormwater runoff than certain artificial constructs, is really important. So I'm elated to hear you say that you are communicating and getting along well with the ES.
Sorry, one last quick thing. Speaking of, a community I'm involved with is actually having the opposite problem where they want to really retain the green space of the Lee Center and really want to make sure that they lobby to the county about that. How do you guys approach that when community members actually want to keep something that's a part of public land? There's conversations about about what to do with the future of the Lee Center, and they want to make sure that the current footprint doesn't extend beyond and encroach upon the green space.
Yeah, in a handful of ways, and that's sort of a particular example that I will get to, but on sort of a more generic level, I guess, through the park master planning process is a great way to get involved in terms of how a park or a public space may be redeveloped or which aspects of its current configuration are retained through that process. The other is through comp planning exercises like this, where we've tried to set, for example, a 40% tree canopy coverage goal for new public parks in SD1. So there are ways to influence kind of the broad policy guidance that then trickles down to those more specific planning efforts. And then with the Lee Center, because it's sort of part and parcel of the Plan Langston sector plan, those types of sector or area plans are another opportunity to kind of take a small chunk of the county and examine the policy priorities, whether that's green space, whether that's public space that may not be green, whether it's affordable housing. And so those are kind of three of the tiers to get involved. The other way is more operational, through park maintenance, through the tree stewards, through some of our volunteer organizations, and in direct communication with urban forestry. Is there nearby private property that somebody in the community has access to or control of that might be able to avail themselves to the tree canopy fund, for example, so that if the character of a public property changes, are there ways to offset that or recover those benefits within that same geography? Without really knowing the specifics of that process and in the Lee Center, that's kind of the broad guidance I would give as kind of the tiers of involvement from sort of the countywide to the regional within the sector plan, kind of regional within the county to specific public spaces and specific programs around public spaces.
Great, thank you.
Other comments? Yes, Commissioner Peterson.
You. So I noticed there's a focus on invasive species in the plan, which makes sense. And it talked a lot about invasive plant species. How would you compare the prioritization of like invasive pests, like the spotted lanternfly, and like how this plan prioritizes plants versus pests and attacking both of these things that are going to hurt our trees?
I think like the best way to think about this, and regretful that my colleague Jen, sort of our invasives manager, isn't here. that we wouldn't, I think we prioritize based on impact and urgency rather than on whether it's a plant or an insect or a mammal or things like that. So I know the spotted lanternfly, emerald ash borer, all of these things are front of mind as well as Atlantis and microstegium and all of the plants that we're dealing with. Kind of the good thing, and I'm getting a little bit out of my lane in the operational sense here, so please, don't take all of this with a grain of salt. I think that we have a really robust volunteer program that helps us with plants, and they don't move as quickly either. So we have a little bit of a tailwind there, but the way the plan kind of frames this is we know this is going to become sort of an increasing problem as climate change progresses. The ranges of things change. Native species may be outcompeted by shifting climate regimes. We also have like a really good tailwind in terms of our volunteer organizations and regional partnerships and cooperation. And even within Arlington, like National Park Service, DOD and Nova Parks, great partners there. So we've tried to lay the policy framework for staying on top of these things in the plan, but
So the plan equally prioritizes the various types of threats.
that's our intent, is that like whichever is the most virulent or impactful, that's probably the priority of that year's cycle of invasive removal, with the acknowledgement that we don't want to lose ground on ones that we've made progress towards control as well. I'd be happy if there's more detailed follow-up questions. I'm happy to follow up with our natural resources folks on your behalf or connect you all. But in terms of the plan, we try to frame invasives as sort of a compounding climate-related problem and as one that requires a community-wide solution.
My kids are trained to step on those lanternflies.
Good, thank you, by the way.
But I very much agree with the larger emphasis urgency. That the plan really needs to have that pretty much progressive in one end to the other, that this has to be dealt with. We're certainly dealing with it in the planning commission. These are issues that keep coming up and keep raised. I don't know how many times the planning commission meeting we said, the applicant, have you talked to the county forester, for what your plantings are going to be? We really want to make clear that we want native species. We want a variety of things. We want to be able to have pollinators friendly. This comes up pretty, I think every single SPRC meeting, planning commission meeting, these issues have come up, have been emphasized to the applicants. So, this plan is certainly very, very timely. And it is something that we are always referring to at planning commission for these issues.
Yeah.
Anybody else have anything else? That's twice. Great. If anybody does have comments, I'm sure Ryan will be more than happy to answer. It's going to be quite busy the next few weeks before it comes for the planning commission. Besides planning commission, have you finished your rounds with Forestry and Natural Resources Commission and other commissions?
We will be visiting Enerjack, as I said, on Monday to kind of go into the deep dive of the engagement feedback from last time around. We'll probably be, we haven't scheduled all of them yet. We'll probably be visiting in October, most of our commissions for status updates in advance.
Very good.
We don't have any public comment.
Not today, not for this. Anyway, thank you. It's only 8:45. You don't have to go to 9:30. Congratulations, folks. But I think we really did cover this, so I don't think we're prematurely cutting this off. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, staff, for making this work so smoothly for the presentation, Brian. I really appreciate this. That was an amazing amount of work. And like I said, it's sorely needed. And make sure you really are working with Plant Langston Boulevard with Natasha, because we're coming up on that also. We're going in parallel with Utah RTA. And so I want to make sure what you're doing is reflected in what that plan is coming up with. There's a very big component on Green Main Street. Trees is a big thing of it because it's way fun. Everybody thinks of Northern Arlington is nice and green and leafy. except for Langston Boulevard. You know, there are just nowhere near the number of trees that can and should be along that corridor. So, yes, please work it up. Okay, thank you all.
Thanks for that great plan.